There was a man walking through the flooding rooms. His name was Thomas Andrews. He had designed the ship. He knew every compartment and every calculation that had gone into her construction. At approximately 12:15 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, he walked back to the bridge and told Captain Edward Smith what he had found below the waterline. 5 compartments were taking water. The ship could survive 4. The bow would pull down. The water would come over the bulkheads. The ship would sink. He estimated 1 hour, perhaps a little more, not 2. Outside the window, the sea was flat and dark and still. The ship was upright and fully lit. In the corridors above, the passengers were asleep or standing in confusion in their evening clothes, wondering why the engines had stopped. The world they were standing in looked entirely normal. It had already ended. It simply had not announced itself yet. Tonight we trace everything that led to that moment and everything that followed it. We start 15,000 years ago with snow falling on Greenland. We follow the iceberg that snow became across 5,000 kilometers of open ocean to the night. It appeared as a dark shape in the path of a ship moving at 22 knots. We follow the warnings that described it and the one critical message that never arrived. And we follow the 2 hours and 40 minutes during which the Titanic tried to put 710 people into lifeboats that could hold 1,178, while 2,224 people were aboard. The full story, in detail, starting now. If you enjoy our nighttime science journeys here on Earth at night, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We love it when our community shares thoughts in the comments and reacts to each other. That is where the real conversation begins. Now let us start. Tonight you will hear the story of a ship that the world called unsinkable. You will hear about an iceberg that had been traveling toward a single moment in history for approximately 15,000 years. You will meet the people who went to sleep in warm beds 4 days into what should have been a routine ocean crossing and never came home. You will hear the story of a warning that arrived at the right time and never reached the right person. And you will hear what was found at the bottom of the North Atlantic in the summer of 2024. Nearly 115 years after the disaster, a research team spent 20 days photographing a wreck that is slowly and quietly returning to the sea floor. What they found was both a discovery and a loss. We will get there. But first, let us begin where everything began. In the dark, in the cold. At the exact moment when a barely felt tremor changed everything. Chapter 1. The barely felt blow. The night of April 14th, 1912, was one of the clearest the North Atlantic had offered in weeks. There was no moon. The sky was dense with stars, and the sea below them was still, perfectly still. There were no swells large enough to catch light, and no waves breaking against anything unseen in the water ahead. Just a flat black surface stretching in every direction with no texture and no horizon that the eye could clearly locate. The air was cold. Not unpleasantly so at first, but by the late evening hours a deep cold had settled in, the kind that pressed through coats and worked its way into the skin without announcement. The water temperature that night was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing. The salt content kept it liquid, but only barely. Anything that entered that water would not survive it for long. On the bridge of the RMS Titanic, the watch rotation was calm and unhurried. The ship had been underway for 4 days. She had departed Southampton on April 10th. She had called at Cherbourg in France and then at Queenstown on the southern coast of Ireland before entering the open Atlantic. Everything since then had been exactly as expected. The sea had behaved, the engines had performed, the schedules held. There was nothing unusual about this night. No weather to manage and no particular concern on the bridge. The ship was moving at approximately 22 knots. Full commercial speed. She was a vessel that had every reason to feel certain of herself, and her officers felt it too. The maiden voyage was proceeding smoothly. There was no reason to expect otherwise. Up in the crow's nest, Two lookouts stood their watch. Their names were Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. They stood on a small open platform high above the forward deck, and their job was simple: scan the darkness ahead. Report anything that required attention. They had no binoculars that night. The binoculars that normally accompanied the crow's nest post had gone missing before the voyage began, and no replacement had been sourced. This fact would later be examined with great care in the inquiries that followed. Whether binoculars would have made a decisive difference given the conditions is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. The night offered very little to aid a human eye regardless of equipment. There were no waves breaking white against any dark obstacle ahead, no weather disturbance on the horizon. Just black water meeting a black sky and stars that were beautiful and entirely unhelpful as warning systems. The sea was so calm that night that it created its own specific danger. In normal conditions, the base of an iceberg creates a slight riffling of water around it, a small disturbance at the surface that an experienced eye can learn to read as a sign of something solid below. But that night, the ocean was flat in every direction. The water around the base of any obstacle ahead would look exactly the same as the water everywhere else. The lookouts were watching for something that the conditions had conspired to make nearly invisible. Frederick Fleet was looking ahead when he saw it. Not the gleaming white mountain of popular imagination, not a towering shape bright against a dark sky. What he saw was a shadow, a darkness within darkness. A shape without clear edges rising from the surface of the sea in the direct path of the ship. He rang the bell in the crow's nest 3 times, the signal for an obstacle directly ahead. He picked up the telephone line to the bridge, and when someone answered, he gave a report that would echo through history. Iceberg right ahead. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch received the warning and acted immediately. He ordered the helm hard to starboard. He rang the telegraph to the engine room, calling for full stop and then full astern. The ship began to respond. But a vessel of this size does not respond quickly. She had a momentum that was not merely a matter of speed. It was mass. It was inertia. It was the weight of nearly 47,000 tons of steel and machinery and human life resisting the command to change course. The bow began to swing to port. Slowly, the iceberg drew closer with every second. The ship did not strike the iceberg head-on. The bow had already begun its turn when contact was made. The iceberg passed along the starboard side of the hull and then slipped away into the darkness behind the ship. The encounter lasted seconds, and what those aboard felt was almost nothing. In some of the forward cabins on the lower decks, passengers later reported a faint scraping sensation, a sound described variously as a brief grinding noise or a vibration running upward through the floor. In other cabins, nothing at all was felt. Some passengers who were still awake noticed a slight shudder passing through the walls. Others slept straight through it entirely. Men playing cards in the smoking room on the upper deck glanced up briefly and returned to their game. The sensation was compared in multiple accounts to a train passing over a rough joint in the track. Something momentarily irregular, and then gone. The ship kept moving, then slowed. The engines went quiet. The night returned to stillness. But below the waterline, the iceberg had already done its work, silently, completely, beneath the reach of any eye above deck. The popular image of the disaster involves a dramatic rupture, a great hole torn open by a single powerful blow. This is not what happened, and this matters deeply to understanding everything that followed. What the iceberg did, as it passed along the hull, was apply pressure to the seams between the steel plates at multiple points. It opened gaps and buckled riveted joints across the first 5 of the 16 watertight compartments. Water began entering not through one dramatic wound, but through a series of smaller failures spread along a significant length of the hull. The damage was entirely invisible from above, and the ship could only remain afloat if no more than 4 of her forward compartments flooded. 5 were already compromised. The engineering mathematics of survival had already been decided. Those on deck simply did not know it yet. From the deck, the ship looked exactly as she had moments before. She was upright. She was fully lit. Her systems were responding. The engineering crew below was at their stations. There was no visible damage. No flooding had yet reached any passenger space. The corridor outside your cabin still felt familiar and warm. Nothing in the air announced what had happened. Captain Edward John Smith arrived on the bridge within minutes. Reports were given in the measured language of professional seamen. The ship had struck ice on the starboard side. The engines were stopped. The ship appeared intact. Thomas Andrews, the chief designer of Titanic, was summoned from his quarters. He would need to go below and assess the damage firsthand. He had designed this vessel. He knew every compartment and every rivet and every calculation that had gone into her construction. If anyone could determine what had just happened and what it meant, it was Andrews. His assessment would come soon. And when it came, it would be the most quietly devastating piece of information in the room. But in those first minutes, after the barely felt blow, the ship stood still in an utterly quiet sea. No alarm, no visible damage, no sound except the cold and the dark and the stars overhead that had witnessed everything and offered nothing. This is the central dissonance at the heart of the Titanic story. The cause was brief. It was quiet. It produced no fire and no catastrophic rupture visible from above. The effect was absolute. More than 1,500 people would not survive this night. And in the early minutes after the encounter, none of them knew it yet. The world they were living in had already ended. It simply had not announced itself. The stars remained overhead. The sea remained flat and dark below. The great ship stood still in the middle of the North Atlantic and waited for a truth it did not yet know. Chapter 2. 15,000 Years of Ice. Before there was a ship, there was an iceberg. And before there was an iceberg, there was snow. Snow falling silently on a vast and empty landscape in the far north of Greenland, approximately 15,000 years ago. The world at that time looked nothing like the world you know. The ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere had not yet begun their long retreat. The land below the snow was silent and still. No civilization had developed writing yet. No city had been built. The great empires of the ancient world still lay thousands of years in the future. The snow that fell on Greenland that day fell on a planet that did not yet contain the kind of human ambition that would eventually build a vessel like Titanic. It simply fell. It accumulated. It compressed under the weight of the snow that came after it, and it began to wait. Greenland is covered by one of the two largest ice sheets on Earth. In its interior, the ice reaches depths of more than 3 kilometers. That ice is not static. It moves. Slowly, in ways that require decades to perceive, but inexorably and without pause. The ice interior of Greenland behaves like an enormously slow river. Snow falls at the center, and over thousands of years, the accumulated mass flows outward toward the edges of the island. At the coasts, where the land meets the sea, the ice reaches the edge of fjords, deep channels of water carved by ancient movement into the coastal rock. And there, at those fjord walls, something extraordinary happens with regularity. The ice reaches the end of its long journey and breaks free into the sea. A crack forms. A groan moves through thousands of tons of compressed ancient ice, and then a section the size of a city block or larger separates and falls into the cold water below. This process is called carving. A glacier carves a berg into open water, and that berg begins a new journey entirely, one that has nothing to do with time, as most living things experience it. The iceberg that struck Titanic most likely carved from glaciers at the southern tip of Greenland in the late summer or early autumn of 1911. This is not guesswork. Researchers at the University of Sheffield used computer modeling with historical wind and ocean current data from 1912 to trace possible iceberg trajectories backward to their sources. The most probable origin point was a cluster of glaciers in southwest Greenland. The warm years that preceded 1912 had created conditions that accelerated melting and calving at these glaciers. The iceberg that would eventually become famous had almost certainly been moving toward the North Atlantic for more than a year before the Titanic was even launched. Think about what that means. The ship had a construction timeline, a launch date, a fitting out period, a schedule of sea trials and inspections, a maiden voyage departure date, and a planned arrival in New York. All of it planned and organized and confirmed by human beings operating within the normal rhythm of commercial enterprise. Tickets had been purchased. Cargo had been loaded. Families had said their goodbyes at Southampton. The entire human machinery of the voyage had been set in motion months in advance. The iceberg had no schedule. It had no awareness of any of this. It simply moved with the currents, and it moved south. The route it followed is one of the most iceberg-dense corridors on Earth during the spring months. It is sometimes called Iceberg Alley. After carving into the waters off Greenland, the berg moved northward with the West Greenland Current along the western coast of the island. Then it was captured by the Labrador Current, which carried it southward along the eastern coast of Canada. This journey of more than 5,000 kilometers is one of the longest natural migrations of any non-living object on Earth. Most icebergs do not complete it. They fracture, they melt. They ground on shallow sea floors and break apart. Only approximately 1% of all icebergs born in Greenland survive long enough to reach the latitude of the North Atlantic shipping lanes. In April of 1912, approximately 300 icebergs reached those shipping lanes. This was a notably high number for the season. Researchers have since determined it was not an exceptional year by historical standards, but it was above average. The warm and wet conditions of 1908, several years earlier, had produced a large cohort of icebergs that were still working their way southward years later. By the time they reached the shipping lanes, they were smaller than they had been at birth, much smaller. But 9/10 of any iceberg lies below the waterline. What a lookout can see from the deck of a ship is never the full story. It is only the very top of a structure that extends far deeper into the dark water below. The iceberg that struck Titanic had been measured and estimated in various ways, both during and after its journey. In its original state, at the time of carving, it may have displaced an enormous quantity of water. By April of 1912, after a year of exposure to the sun and the sea and the gradually warming waters of the southern Labrador Current, it was substantially smaller. Estimates from survivors who saw it briefly and from photographs taken by ships in the area place it at perhaps 50 to 100 feet above the waterline, a dark shape in a dark night, not a gleaming monument, just a mass of ancient compressed ice drifting indifferently through a cold sea. Two objects converging across completely different timescales met at a single point on the North Atlantic on the night of April 14th, 1912. One had been moving for 15,000 years. The other had been designed and built over a period of 3 years and was following a precise commercial timetable. There was no inevitability to the meeting, no fate, only geometry. And a particular combination of speed and course and night and an absence of moon. Researchers who modeled the iceberg drift calculated that if Titanic had passed through the area just 2 days later, the iceberg would have drifted far enough that the two paths would not have crossed. 2 days. The ship was on a fixed schedule. The iceberg had none. The gap between those two timescales was measured in exactly 2 days, and the consequences of that gap would be measured in more than 1,500 lives. After the collision, the iceberg continued drifting south and east. No one tracked it. No one knew or cared where it went. It had no monument, and no name. Within approximately 14 days, it had drifted into the warmer waters of the Gulf Stream and melted completely. The physical evidence of the most famous maritime disaster in history dissolved into the North Atlantic without trace. By the time the first formal inquiry opened its proceedings in the United States, the iceberg that caused all of this had returned to the ocean. It had briefly passed through. 15,000 years of accumulation, a year of drifting across 5,000 kilometers of open water, seconds of contact with the hull of a ship, and then 14 days until it was gone. The snow that had fallen on a silent Greenland landscape 15,000 years before had completed its journey. It had not known it was on one. It had simply moved as ice moves. It had compressed under the weight of what came after it. It had flowed outward from the interior of a frozen island for thousands of years at a pace too slow for any living eye to witness. It had broken free into the sea. It had drifted south through Iceberg Alley. It had survived the journey that 99 out of every 100 icebergs do not complete. And it had arrived in a precise location on the North Atlantic on a precise night in April. It had not sought that location. It had simply arrived where the currents placed it. The rest was entirely a human story. Chapter 3: The Floating World. There were 2,224 people aboard Titanic on the night of April 14th, 1912. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. 2,224 human beings. Each of them had packed a bag or a trunk. Each of them had said goodbye to someone. Each of them had boarded the ship at Southampton or Cherbourg or Queenstown with some version of a plan for what happened next. America, a new position, a family reunion, a business meeting, a return home. A fresh start. The Titanic carried within it all the ordinary textures of human life in the spring of 1912, and none of those people expected the crossing to be remarkable. The ship was organized into worlds within worlds. 3 passenger classes and a large working crew occupied the same vessel but moved through almost entirely separate physical spaces. The separation was architectural. It was enforced by locked gates and designated staircases and corridors that led only into their own class of space. Passengers from one class did not encounter passengers from another class in any ordinary movement through the ship. And below all the passenger classes were the crew spaces, where the people who actually operated and maintained and cleaned the vessel lived and worked in conditions quite different from anyone traveling above. First class occupied the upper decks. 325 passengers paid fares that in some cases reached several $1,000s in 1912 terms. They traveled in private suites with wood-paneled walls and electric lighting and private promenade decks. The dining saloon was decorated in the manner of an English country house. There was a reading and writing room, a gymnasium, a swimming bath, a squash court. The food was elaborate and served in multiple courses. Among those in first class were some of the wealthiest and most prominent figures in the Western world. Industrialists, financiers, a senior member of the Astors, a senior member of the Guggenheims, men and women who had arrived at the peak of the Edwardian social order and traveled in the manner that peak provided for. Second class aboard Titanic would have been first class on most other liners of the era. Around 285 passengers occupied comfortable cabins. They included professionals, academics, clergy, teachers, people traveling for work or education or modest personal reasons. They dined well and moved through well-maintained shared spaces. Second-class passengers who had sailed on other Atlantic liners often remarked that Titanic felt unusually generous in its accommodation. This was deliberate. White Star had designed the ship to offer an exceptional experience at every level. For second-class passengers, especially the contrast with ordinary Atlantic travel was noticeable. Third class was the largest single group, approximately 709 passengers. For most of them, this was not a holiday or a business trip. It was a permanent departure. They were moving their entire lives. What they carried was not luggage in the conventional sense. It was everything. Everything they owned and everything they had decided to carry into an unknown future. They came from Ireland and Sweden and Croatia and Lebanon and Finland and dozens of other countries. Many had traveled for weeks before they ever set foot on Titanic at Queenstown or Southampton. They were moving toward the United States and Canada in search of work and land and the possibility of a different kind of life. The Adagul 14 were among them, 14 people from the same small townland in County Mayo in the west of Ireland. They had pooled their savings and purchased third-class tickets together. They were neighbors and relatives and friends making the crossing as a group the way their community had done for years. Of the 14, only 3 survived. Their story is one of hundreds like it in third class that night. Families traveling together. Villages represented in the same compartments. Groups of people who had crossed an ocean only to find that the gate to the upper decks did not open in time. The survival statistics from that night are confirmed historical record, and they speak without ambiguity. 62% of first-class passengers survived. 41% of second-class passengers survived. 25% of third-class passengers survived. 24% of crew survived. These numbers are not the result of accident or random chance in the chaos of a sinking ship. They reflect the physical reality of who was closest to the lifeboats and who was farthest away, who had been given information and who had not, which corridors led directly upward and which ones required navigating a ship that many third-class passengers had never been above the lower decks of. There was no malice in the design. The class separation aboard Titanic was the ordinary architecture of its era. Every Atlantic liner operated this way. No one building the ship imagined they were designing a system that would sort people by survival. They were designing a system that sorted people by the fare they had paid. The difference between a first-class suite and a third-class berth was the difference between a door that opened directly onto the boat deck and a door that opened onto a staircase, that opened onto a corridor, that opened onto another staircase, that eventually reached the upper deck, if you knew the route. That difference in distance and familiarity and information turned out to be the difference between 62% and 25%. The two things turned out to be the same. The working crew of Titanic numbered more than 900. Stewards and stewardesses who had been trained in deliberate invisibility appeared and served and withdrew without disturbing the passenger sense that comfort required no effort. Engineers monitored pressures and temperatures in spaces passengers never saw and rarely thought about. Firemen and stokers worked in teams in the boiler rooms below the waterline, shoveling coal into furnaces that burned hundreds of tons per day in conditions of sustained heat and tremendous noise. They worked 4-hour shifts in spaces with no daylight. They came off duty and slept in cramped bunks in the lower decks and rose again and went back below. Trimmers moved coal through the bunkers to maintain balance. Mail clerks sorted letters and packages continuously in the sorting rooms deep inside the ship, making sure correspondence from Europe would reach its destinations on schedule. These were the people who produced the experience of comfort that passengers above them took entirely for granted. Their labor was the actual machinery of the voyage, and most of the passengers never encountered them at all. When the ship began to sink, it was the engineers who stayed longest at their posts. They maintained the electrical systems that kept the lights burning and kept the wireless room powered. Many of them remained below long after the upper decks had been evacuated. Their survival rate was among the lowest aboard. They knew the ship from the inside out, and that knowledge kept them at their stations until the water made staying impossible. More than 1,500 people died. They were from at least 28 countries. They ranged in age from infants to elderly adults traveling on the same crossing. They were the very wealthy and the very poor. They were traveling toward reunions and opportunities and completely ordinary plans that had nothing remarkable about them. Many of them had no connection to each other and would never have met under any other circumstances. What they shared was a ticket on the same ship departing on the same date, and the fact that when the ship stopped moving in the middle of the North Atlantic, there were not enough lifeboats for all of them. The lifeboats had capacity for approximately 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people aboard. The numbers had been set before the voyage began. Everyone who walked up the gangway at Southampton had walked into those numbers without knowing it. Chapter 4. The Age of Certainty. To understand why Titanic happened the way it did, you have to understand the world that built her. It is not enough to say that people were overconfident. Overconfidence is a personal failing. What existed in the Edwardian era was something more systemic and more worth examining than that. It was confidence that had been earned through a long and reliable track record. Confidence that had been validated again and again by decades of genuine achievement. The people who built Titanic and the people who sailed on her were not naive or careless or dismissive of danger. They were people who had lived through one of the most rapid periods of transformation in human history and had watched it work. They had seen the world improve. They had seen the ocean tamed into a scheduled service. Their certainty was not the certainty of people who had never been tested. It was the certainty of people who had been tested repeatedly and had passed every time. The early years of the 20th century in Europe and North America were a period of extraordinary forward momentum. The Industrial Revolution that had begun in the previous century had produced results that would have seemed fantastical to earlier generations. Cities were lit by electricity. Messages could be sent across the Atlantic in minutes by telegraph cable. Automobiles were appearing on city streets. Diseases that had killed millions were being brought under control. Every decade brought improvements that could be pointed to specifically and concretely. The world was becoming safer and faster and more connected in measurable ways. Progress was not an abstract hope. It was an observable pattern with a reliable track record. The ocean had once been the most dangerous part of any transatlantic journey. Storm, navigation error, equipment failure. The history of Atlantic crossing was a history of ships that did not arrive. But by 1912, that history had been superseded. The great steam liners had turned the Atlantic into a scheduled service. Crossing times were predictable. Schedules were maintained within hours of their stated departure and arrival times. The sea was no longer an adventure. It was a commute. Dangerous things had been identified and systems had been built to manage them. The people who traveled on the great liners did not feel they were taking a risk any more significant than boarding a train. The White Star Line operated within this world and shaped its marketing accordingly. White Star made a deliberate, strategic choice in the years before Titanic was built. Cunard, their principal rival, already dominated the market for speed. The Lusitania and the Mauretania held the blue riband for fastest Atlantic crossing and defended it aggressively. White Star decided to compete not on speed, but on something different: size, stability, luxury. The promise of an experience so refined and comfortable that the question of how fast the ship was traveling would simply not arise for passengers who were too well entertained to care about the clock. The Olympic-class ships were born from this philosophy. 3 vessels designed in close collaboration between White Star leadership and the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. Their names were Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. They would be the largest moving objects ever built by human hands. Their funnels alone were wide enough to drive 2 automobiles side by side through them. Their lengths exceeded the height of most buildings then standing in London or New York. They would carry passengers in accommodation that compared favorably to the finest hotels in Europe. Private suites with wood-paneled walls and carved moldings. Dining rooms with crystal chandeliers and menus that changed with every meal. A gymnasium, a swimming pool, a squash court, a reading room with a fireplace and afternoon light through large windows, a Turkish bath decorated in the Moorish style. These were not simply ships, They were floating statements about what human engineering had achieved and what it could provide to those who could afford it. They would operate on schedule and arrive reliably and demonstrate that the mastery of the North Atlantic was not merely functional but genuinely civilized. The word unsinkable entered the conversation around Titanic in this context. Its original meaning was specific and technical. The ship was equipped with 16 watertight compartments running along her lower hull. She had been designed to remain afloat even if her first 4 compartments flooded simultaneously. This was a genuine engineering advancement. For most foreseeable accident scenarios, it was a reasonable calculation. Watertight compartment design had been improving for decades, and Titanic represented a sophisticated application of current knowledge. When promotional materials referred to the vessel in terms of her unsinkability, they were describing a real engineering feature in language intended for a general audience. What happened to that language, as it moved through public reception, is one of the more instructive phenomena in the story. By the time passengers were boarding at Southampton, the word had traveled a considerable distance from its technical origin. It had absorbed the general confidence of the era. It had been amplified by the sheer visual fact of the ship, which at close range produced an almost overwhelming sense of permanence and scale. Something this large felt beyond ordinary misfortune. Not because anyone had reasoned their way to that conclusion through careful analysis, but because the emotional experience of standing next to 47,000 tons of steel simply made catastrophe feel impossible to the nay. Imagination. The ship was too large to be a victim, too solid to fail, too new and too modern, and too carefully constructed to be at genuine risk from the old dangers of the sea that had troubled lesser vessels. Or so it seemed. So, it genuinely seemed. No one aboard Titanic was behaving recklessly in their own estimation. The captain had decades of experience on the North Atlantic and had never lost a ship. The officers were professionals with long records of safe crossings. The engineers had maintained the systems carefully throughout the voyage. The lookouts were at their posts. The wireless operators were in communication with other vessels and with shore stations. The ship was following a course that was standard practice for the time of year and for the conditions known to exist in the area. Ice warnings had been received during the day, but ice on the shipping lanes in April was a known condition and had been navigated safely for years. The prevailing practice was to post additional lookouts and maintain speed and rely on sufficient warning time from the crow's nest. This was how Atlantic crossings were conducted in 1912. It was how they had always been conducted. Multiple experienced captains made similar decisions on similar nights, and nothing happened. The absence of previous disaster was taken as evidence of sufficient safety. This is not stupidity. It is the reasoning of people who have been right before. It is the reasoning of any era that has not yet met its particular edge. The Edwardian era had built a world in which the responsible management of complex systems reliably produced safe outcomes. The people aboard Titanic were living inside that world and operating within its assumptions every hour of the voyage. They had boarded a ship that looked and felt and functioned like the most advanced expression of human engineering. They were crossing an ocean that had been crossed thousands of times without incident. They were in the hands of officers who knew their jobs and a crew that had been trained for their roles. They had every rational reason to feel safe. The confidence they carried was not a character flaw. It was a reasonable conclusion drawn from the available evidence. What the available evidence did not include was what happens when a system meets the one scenario it was not designed for. That lesson cost more than 1,500 lives to learn, and the world that emerged on the other side of the disaster was changed by it in ways that still govern how ships are built and operated today. The age of certainty did not end on April 15th, 1912, but it received its most famous and lasting challenge. Chapter 5. Steel and Intention. Every ship begins as an idea. Titanic began as a conversation between two men over dinner. The year was approximately 1907. Lord William James Pirrie was the chairman of Harland and Wolff. J. Bruce Ismay was the chairman of the White Star Line. They met at Pirrie House in London, and over the course of an evening, arrived at the outline of what would become the Olympic-class program. 3 ships of extraordinary size, not the fastest on the Atlantic but the largest. Not racing machines but palaces. The conversation that evening was a commercial strategy, and it became one of the most consequential dinners in maritime history. By the time the men left the table, the broad shape of Titanic existed as a concept. The rest was 3 years of engineering and labor. The Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast was already one of the largest and most capable in the world. But building ships of the Olympic-class scale required new infrastructure. The yard built a new gantry structure specifically to accommodate the construction. 2 ships would be built simultaneously, side by side. Olympic first and then Titanic. Workers would move between both. Lessons learned on Olympic would be applied directly to Titanic as she rose alongside her sister. The gantry structure that covered both construction berths was at the time one of the largest industrial structures in the British Isles. It was visible across much of Belfast. The scale of what was being attempted was not hidden. It announced itself to everyone who lived and worked in the city. Construction on Titanic began formally in March of 1909. The keel was the first element laid down, a central spine of steel running nearly 900 feet in length along the bottom of the ship. Everything would be built upward from that spine. The frames came next. Steel ribs curving up from the keel on both sides, hundreds of them spaced evenly apart forming the skeleton of the hull. Then the plating. Sheets of steel up to an inch thick fastened to the frames by rivets. 3 million rivets in total across the finished ship. Workers called riveters worked in gangs of 4. One heated the rivet until it glowed, one passed it, one held it in place, one hammered it home. The sound of riveting crews at full work was audible across the entire yard. It was the sound of the ship being made. The workforce employed on Titanic at peak construction numbered more than 3,000 people. They worked 6 days a week in all weather. On the scaffolding that surrounded the rising hull, workers labored in the open air through the cold and wet Belfast winters and autumns without shelter from the wind coming in off the lough. Falls from scaffolding were not uncommon, burns from the rivet heating process, crushing injuries from steel plates, being moved by cranes that were operated with skill but not infallibility. The construction of Titanic cost the lives of several workers during its build. Their names are less remembered than the names of those who would later die at sea, but they were the first cost of the ship. The ship asked something of everyone who touched it from the beginning. By the time the hull was complete and ready for launching, Titanic measured 882 feet in length. She was 92 feet wide. From keel to the top of her 4 funnels, she rose 175 feet. Her gross tonnage was just over 46,000 tons. She was the largest ship in the world at that moment. Olympic, her sister, had launched months earlier and held the record briefly before Titanic surpassed her. The launch on May 31, 1911, was a significant event, but not a celebratory one in the traditional sense. There was no bottle of champagne broken against the hull. White Star had a policy against that particular tradition. A large crowd gathered to watch. The ship was coated in tallow and soap to ease her entry into the water. A hydraulic trigger was released, and Titanic slid down the slipway and entered the water of the River Lagan. The whole process took 62 seconds. She was immediately taken in hand by tugs and moved to the fitting-out dock where she would spend the next 10 months being completed. The launch was just a hull. The Titanic that would sail in April 1912 bore almost no resemblance to what entered the water that May day. The fitting-out period was when the ship became herself. Boilers were installed, engines were lowered into place, mechanical systems were connected. The interior was constructed from the inside out. Paneling and carvings went into the first-class spaces. Plumbing was installed throughout. The kitchen was equipped. The swimming pool was tiled. The furniture arrived. The bed linens arrived. The silverware arrived. Dozens of different trades were working simultaneously in different parts of the ship, turning an empty steel hull into a functioning hotel that could sustain more than 2,000 human lives in the middle of the ocean for a week at a piece. Thomas Andrews was central to this process. He was Harland and Wolff Managing Director of Design, and he was the person who understood the ship most completely. He knew every compartment. He knew every bulkhead height and every pump rate and every calculation that had gone into her construction. The watertight compartment system was among the features he was most familiar with. 16 compartments running the length of the lower hull. The ship had been designed and the calculation confirmed to remain afloat, with the first 4 compartments flooded simultaneously. This was a genuine engineering achievement. The scenario it was designed against covered the vast majority of foreseeable collision scenarios. A head-on collision, a glancing blow on the bow. Most ordinary accidents at sea. What it had not been designed against was the precise and unusual geometry of what happened on the night of April 14th. The iceberg had not punched through one compartment. It had applied pressure along a significant length of the hull and opened 5 of them. The design was sound. The disaster simply fell outside the envelope the design had drawn around safety. Andrews was a thorough and modest man by all accounts. He sailed on the maiden voyage partly as a matter of professional practice. Designers of complex ships often accompanied them on initial voyages to identify any issues needing attention. Andrews had a list of minor adjustments he planned to recommend to White Star after the crossing. Small things. The ship was essentially right. He would spend the last hours of his life in the ship he had built, carrying the knowledge that it was going to sink and nothing could be done to stop it. The sea trials took place in early April 1912, in the waters off Belfast Lough, and then in the open sea beyond. The ship maneuvered through a series of standard tests. The engines were run to full power. The steering was evaluated at different speeds. Emergency stops were timed. Everything performed within the expected parameters. The Board of Trade Inspector, who was present throughout, signed off on the vessel as seaworthy and fit to carry passengers on international voyages. She was certified. Her lifeboats were tested. Her watertight doors were operated. The formalities of safety verification were completed and recorded. On April 10, 1912, she departed Southampton on her maiden voyage. The departure itself was not without incident. As Titanic moved through the confined channel at Southampton, the enormous displacement of water she created caused the moored liner New York to snap its mooring lines and swing toward the Titanic before being brought under control by tugs. It was a brief and unnerving moment. The 2 ships came close but did not touch. The voyage continued. The incident was noted by observers on the dock and forgotten by most who were already settled aboard. Everything about the departure was as planned. Everything about the ship was as intended. 3,000 workers had spent 3 years building something extraordinary, and it was now at sea. It was doing what it had been built to do. Chapter 6. The Operators. In the early years of wireless telegraphy at sea, there was a question that had not yet been resolved by any maritime authority. Whose men were the wireless operators? Who did they work for? Who gave them their orders, and what were their priorities when those priorities conflicted? The answer in 1912 was complicated. The wireless operators aboard most major ocean liners were not employed by the shipping companies themselves. They were employed by the Marconi International Marine Communication Company. Marconi had developed the wireless technology and held the patents and trained the operators and leased the equipment to the shipping lines. The operators wore Marconi uniforms. They were Marconi employees first and ship employees in only a partial sense. They were expected to cooperate with the ships they served on, but their primary professional identity and their primary revenue obligations ran through Marconi. This distinction mattered more than it appeared to on paper. Senior wireless operator Jack Phillips was 25 years old. He had been working for Marconi since he was a teenager and had developed into one of their most capable operators. He was fast and reliable and had logged considerable experience on Atlantic and other routes before joining Titanic for her maiden voyage. He was known among his colleagues for his speed as a telegrapher. His ability to send and receive at high rates without error was genuinely exceptional. Junior operator Harold Bride was 22. He was newer to the role, but competent and enthusiastic. The two men worked rotating shifts in a small room near the top of the forward superstructure. It was a cramped space filled with equipment. The transmitter generated considerable heat, and the air inside was warm regardless of the cold outside. The receiver required careful and continuous attention. The work was technical and demanding, and the two operators took it seriously. They were proud of the system they managed. It was among the most powerful then in use at sea. The wireless system aboard Titanic was among the most powerful then in use at sea. It had a range, under normal conditions, of several hundred miles, and under favorable atmospheric conditions could reach considerably farther. On clear nights, signals from Titanic had reached as far as the eastern seaboard of the United States. This was remarkable technology, and the ship was rightly proud of it. Passengers used it extensively. First-class passengers in particular sent personal messages to friends and business associates on shore throughout the voyage. These were not emergencies or navigation communications. They were the social and commercial traffic of wealthy people who had grown accustomed to being in contact regardless of their location. This traffic was the source of the first tension. The Marconi operators were paid partly on the volume of passenger messages they processed. The commercial traffic paid. The navigational communications between ships were professional courtesies that generated no revenue. When vessels on the same frequency attempted to pass ice warnings or position reports to Titanic and the wireless room was busy processing passenger traffic, the navigational message was sometimes set aside. This was not negligence in any simple sense. It was a structural feature of how the wireless system had been organized. The commercial purpose and the safety purpose occupied the same frequency and the same operator and were not formally ranked against each other. On the morning of April 14th, 1912, the wireless system aboard Titanic experienced an equipment failure and went down for several hours. Phillips spent much of the day repairing it alongside the ship electrician. By the time it was restored and operational again, there was a significant backlog of passenger messages waiting to be transmitted to the relay station at Cape Race on the Newfoundland coast. Phillips and Bride worked through the evening, clearing this backlog. This context matters for understanding what happened when ice warnings began arriving from other ships. As the day progressed, some were received, some were acknowledged, some were passed to the bridge, and at least one critical warning was interrupted mid-reception because Phillips needed the frequency cleared for Cape Race traffic. There was also the matter of the Californian. The steamship Californian was operating in the same region that night and had stopped in the ice earlier in the evening when her captain judged conditions too dangerous to continue in darkness. Her wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had been attempting to communicate with Titanic and alert her to the ice field ahead. When Evans reached out shortly before he was due to go off duty, Phillips was in the middle of transmitting a heavy volume of passenger traffic to Cape Race. The signal from Evans was loud because the Californian was close. Too close. It overrode the Cape Race signal in Phillips' headphones. Phillips sent back a sharp response telling Evans to stand by because he was busy with Cape Race. Evans waited briefly and then went off duty at 11:10 p.m. He did not wait for a response. He was tired and his shift was over, and the system did not require him to maintain a watch through the night. 30 minutes later, Titanic struck the iceberg. When Captain Smith ordered Phillips to begin transmitting distress calls shortly after midnight, Phillips began immediately without hesitation. He sent the established distress call sign first, CQD. Then, at the suggestion of Bride, he added the newer signal that had been internationally agreed upon only recently, SOS. The two signals went out alternately into the dark surrounding ocean. The position he transmitted was the calculated position provided by Fourth Officer Boxhall, working with the charts and navigation instruments at the bridge. Multiple ships received the signals. The Carpathia received it, and Captain Arthur Rostron ordered an immediate course change and called his crew to emergency stations before he even fully understood what he was heading toward. The Frankfurt received it, but initially failed to understand the urgency of the situation clearly and asked clarifying questions that cost precious minutes. The Mount Temple received it. The Baltic received it. The Olympic received it from far to the east, but she was far too distant to arrive in time. The signals were going out and ships were responding, and yet the ocean was still very large and very cold, and the nearest vessel that could help was still hours away. Phillips transmitted through the deteriorating conditions of the ship for more than 2 hours. As the bow lowered and the angle of the ship increased, he remained at his post. The electrical systems were maintained by the engineering crew below, who kept the generators running as long as physically possible, specifically to preserve power to the wireless room. When Captain Smith released the operators from duty shortly before the end, Phillips and Bride both left the room. Bride survived. Phillips did not. He was last seen on one of the collapsible lifeboats that was swept off the deck by the rising water. He was not among the survivors recovered by Carpathia. He was 25 years old, and he had been doing his job precisely as he had been trained to do it until the water made it impossible to continue. What the story of the wireless operators reveals most clearly is not individual failure. It is the gap between a new technology and the organizational structures needed to support it safely. The wireless was powerful, and it worked remarkably well. But its divided employment structure and its commercial priorities, and the fact that a single operator could simply go to sleep and leave a ship without any wireless coverage at all, created vulnerabilities that no one had yet identified as requiring formal regulation. The disaster changed this in a direct and lasting way. One of the first and most immediately practical reforms that followed was the requirement for 24-hour wireless watchkeeping on all passenger vessels at sea. The frequency could no longer go unmonitored through the night hours because an operator was tired or off duty. That gap was closed. The lesson was learned. The cost of learning it was high beyond measure, but the lesson was clear and it was acted on. Chapter 7. Southampton to the Sea. The 10th of April 1912 was a Wednesday. In the port of Southampton, the morning began with the ordinary activity of a major ocean liner preparing to depart. Coal was loaded. Provisions were inspected and stowed. Crew reported to their stations. Passengers arrived at the docks in carriages and motor cars. Trunks were lifted aboard. Children were carried up gangways. The process of departing was itself a complex operation, requiring hundreds of coordinated decisions, and it ran throughout the morning with reasonable efficiency. Southampton in 1912 was one of the busiest passenger ports in the world. The great transatlantic liners came and went regularly, and the dock workers and port staff had seen many departures. But even by the standards of that busy port, the arrival and departure of Titanic drew notice. She was the largest ship ever to leave Southampton. Her funnels were visible from miles away. Her hull, alongside the dock, occupied a presence that made the surrounding structures look modest. People came to the waterfront simply to see her. They stood on the dock and looked upward at the black hull and the rows of portholes and the 4 great funnels painted in the colors of the White Star Line. They had read about her in the newspapers. They had heard about her from people who had worked on her at Belfast. And here she was, real and enormous, and about to go. The passengers who boarded at Southampton were a cross-section of the world the Titanic was meant to serve. First-class passengers included some of the most recognizable names in business and society on both sides of the Atlantic. John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, the co-owner of Macy department stores, and his wife Ida, who would refuse to leave her husband for a lifeboat. Margaret Brown, who would later become famous as the unsinkable Molly Brown for her conduct during the evacuation. These were people whose names appeared in newspapers and whose movements were tracked by society reporters and whose presence aboard Titanic was itself a story. Second class was full of professionals and families making the crossing for work or reunion. A clergyman returning from a conference, a teacher going to visit relatives, an academic on his way to a new position. Third class was largely immigrants. Many of them had traveled considerable distances just to reach Southampton. For them, the departure was the end of one very long journey and the beginning of another entirely. They had left homes and towns, and in some cases, entire countries that they would never see again. What they were moving toward was entirely uncertain. What they were leaving behind was entirely familiar. That combination produced a particular kind of hopefulness and a particular kind of grief that the forward motion of the ship could neither answer nor resolve. The ship departed at noon. As she moved through the narrow channel leading out of the dock, the displacement of water created by her enormous hull caused the moored liner New York to strain against her mooring lines. The lines snapped. The New York swung toward Titanic in a slow arc that brought the two ships within feet of each other before tugs intervened and brought the New York under control. It was an unnerving moment watched by hundreds of people on both vessels and on the dock. A collision at Southampton between the world's largest new ship and a moored liner before the maiden voyage had even properly begun would have been an extraordinary embarrassment. The moment passed. The tugs held. Titanic continued out into the Solent and began her voyage. She called at Cherbourg on the northern coast of France that same evening. Additional passengers came aboard from tender boats. The port at Cherbourg was not large enough to accommodate Titanic at the dock, so passengers were ferried out to the ship at anchor in the harbour. Among those who boarded at Cherbourg were some of the most wealthy individuals in first class. They came up the gangway with their luggage and their staff and settled into their suites, and the ship turned south toward Ireland. Queenstown, now called Cobb, on the south coast of Ireland, the final stop before the open Atlantic. More passengers boarded here by tender. Many of them were Irish emigrants making the crossing to America. They were the last to come aboard, and many of them stood on the stern deck as the coast of Ireland receded behind the ship and watched it go. For some, it was the last time they would see their country. The tenders that had brought them out returned to shore carrying a small number of passengers who had decided at Queenstown not to continue the voyage for their own private reasons. They stepped back onto Irish soil and watched the ship move away across the harbour and out toward the open sea. They stood and watched until it was gone. They were among the luckiest people in this entire story. They did not know that yet. They could not have known it. The ship looked exactly as it was supposed to look, enormous and steady, and moving with calm authority toward the open ocean. The first days of the crossing were calm and genuinely pleasant. The sea was light, the weather was cold but clear. The ship performed smoothly and without any sign of the mechanical difficulty that new vessels sometimes showed on their first deep water run. Passengers settled into the rhythms of ocean travel that had been refined over decades by the great liner companies. Meals were served in full and attended with the kind of social formality that first and second class Atlantic crossings still expected in 1912. The public rooms filled with conversation in the mornings and with card games and music in the evenings. The officers kept their watches in the professional quiet of a well-run ship. The engineers managed the engines below in the warmth of the engine rooms. The stokers worked in the boiler rooms. The mail clerks sorted letters. The stewards served. The ship made its way westward across an ocean that offered no resistance and no warning sign of any kind. It was a good crossing so far. The kind of crossing that had been made many hundreds of times before on ships of this type and on this route. The officers were aware that there was ice ahead. Wireless messages had been arriving from other vessels throughout April. 14th, reporting field ice and bergs on or near the shipping lanes, in the area Titanic was approaching. These messages were received and noted and in most cases passed to the bridge. The positions of reported ice were marked. The information was shared through the normal channels of watch handover. Captain Smith had altered the course slightly in the early afternoon, moving the standard route a few miles further south. This was a precaution, a common one. A small southward deviation was the standard practice when ice had been reported on the lanes. It moved the track away from the area most heavily noted in the earlier warnings. The ship would approach the ice region during the night of April 14th at its standard commercial speed. The lookouts would be alert to anything ahead. The ship would pass through as ships of her type had passed through similar conditions before without incident. The ice warnings had been received and the information had been acted on. That was the professional standard of the era, and it had been met. What neither the captain nor the officers knew as the evening progressed was that another warning was coming, a warning that described ice precisely on the course Titanic was following, a warning with a specific position, a warning that if delivered to the bridge and acted upon might have changed the speed of the ship or the course before the night reached its critical moment. That warning existed. It had been received. It had simply not yet found its way to the right hands. The ship moved through a night that was clear and cold and absolutely still. It was the last night that felt ordinary. Chapter 8. Full Speed. Captain Edward John Smith was 62 years old on the night of April 14, 1912. He had been at sea since he was a teenager and had spent virtually his entire adult life on the North Atlantic. He had commanded many ships across a career that stretched back to the age of sail and had witnessed the transformation of ocean travel from canvas and wood to steel and steam. He had crossed the ocean hundreds of times in all conditions the sea offered: fog, ice, storm, the ordinary grinding monotony of a winter crossing, and the rare and terrifying power of a North Atlantic gale. He had seen all of it and brought his ships and his passengers through. He was, by every professional measure, one of the most experienced and respected commanders in the White Star Line and in the broader world of Atlantic passenger service. Officers who served under him spoke of his steadiness. His presence on the bridge during difficult conditions was described as calming. He did not panic. He did not overreact. He assessed and decided and acted. His record was not without incident. Earlier in his career, he had been involved in 2 collisions that resulted in some damage to vessels under his command. But these were the ordinary hazards of a long career in a demanding profession, and they had not diminished his standing with the company or in the estimation of colleagues who understood that such things happened in the confined waters of busy ports. He was a man the company trusted with its most important ships. Titanic was to be his final command before retirement. He had said so publicly. After this voyage, he intended to stop. There is a version of the Titanic story in which Captain Smith was reckless, in which he drove the ship too fast through a known ice field because of commercial pressure from J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star, who was traveling aboard and who wanted the ship to make a strong showing on her maiden crossing. This version has been popular for over a century because it offers a clear villain and a satisfying simple cause. The evidence for it is limited and disputed by historians. Ismay was aboard and was a commercially minded man who had interests in the voyage going well. But the decision to maintain speed through the ice region was not an unusual departure from normal practice in 1912. It was precisely what experienced Atlantic captains did. It was what Smith had done before on similar nights with similar warnings. The practice existed and continued year after year because it had not yet produced a disaster severe enough to force a change. What is confirmed is this. By the afternoon of April 14th, Titanic had received several wireless messages from other ships reporting ice in the general area she was approaching. The America reported 2 large icebergs. The Caronia had reported field ice earlier in the voyage. The Baltic reported field ice and a large quantity of it to the north. Captain Smith received the Baltic message and showed it to Ismay, who put it in his pocket for several hours before returning it to the bridge. The precise significance of this exchange has been debated. What is clear is that the information about ice was available and known at the senior levels of the ship. In the mid-afternoon, Captain Smith made one adjustment. The standard planned course across the Atlantic had a turning point called the Corner, where ships turned from a southwestward track to a more westward one. Smith delayed this turn slightly. He kept going south for a few extra miles before making the turn west. This was intended to move the track away from the most northern areas of reported ice and place the ship on a slightly more southerly path through the region. It was a measured and professional response to the information available. It did not slow the ship. Why not slow down? This is the question that has echoed through every examination of the disaster since April of 1912. The answer requires understanding what slowing down meant in the context of the era and in the context of the specific night. Slowing down was not standard practice when ice was reported. Standard practice was to post additional lookouts and maintain vigilance and proceed. The assumption was that a lookout in the crow's nest on a clear night would see an iceberg at sufficient distance to allow the ship to maneuver around it. This assumption had proven reliable many times before. Ships crossed the North Atlantic in ice season regularly. They did not slow down routinely. The practice of slowing was not the norm, and departing from the norm required a positive decision to act differently from how experienced captains had always acted. There was also the question of what slowing down actually produced. Reducing speed in the middle of a known ice field did not eliminate the risk. It simply spread the time of exposure. A ship moving slowly through an ice field spent more time among the bergs. The argument for maintaining speed was not simply about schedule. It was the coherent professional judgment that a faster ship with alert lookouts would pass through the ice region more quickly, and that the combination of speed and visibility provided sufficient safety margin. This was the reasoning, and it was wrong, but it was not unreasonable within the framework of knowledge and experience available at the time. Captain Smith retired to his quarters early on the evening of April 14th. He had attended a dinner party given by first-class passengers in the reception room and had socialized in the manner that a captain of a prestigious liner was expected to. Present and pleasant and speaking with the easy confidence of a man who had crossed this ocean many hundreds of times and found nothing about it threatening. He excused himself at around 9 in the evening. Before leaving the bridge, he gave instructions to the officer of the watch to be called if conditions changed in any way. He made his way along the short passage to his quarters, which opened directly onto the bridge. The night was clear and cold. The sea was calm. The ship was steady and performing well. There was nothing in what his professional senses could perceive that suggested the night would be anything other than what 1,000 previous nights on this ocean had been. He had every reason to sleep, and he did. The watch that took over at 10 p.m. continued the course and speed. First Officer Murdoch assumed the watch. The night was beautiful in the way that very cold, clear Atlantic nights can be. The stars dense overhead and the sea below them a mirror of the same darkness with no horizon the eye could find. Murdoch took his place at the bridge. The crow's nest watch changed at the same hour. Fleet and Lee took up their positions on the open platform above the forward deck and began scanning the darkness ahead. The ship continued westward at approximately 22 knots. No moon, a flat black sea that offered nothing back, stars overhead that were present and indifferent. An hour and 40 minutes later, Frederick Fleet rang the bell. What happened in that hour and 40 minutes was ordinary in every way. No alarm. No unusual reading from the instruments, no warning from the lookouts. The sea gave nothing away. The ship that had been built to master the Atlantic moved through the dark at full speed toward a shadow that was not yet visible, and that by the time it became visible was already too close to avoid entirely. The captain was asleep. The watch was alert. The ship was doing exactly what it had been doing for 4 days. Everything was normal, until it was not. Chapter 9. 7 Warnings. On the day that Titanic sank, the sea had been speaking for hours. Not in any mysterious or metaphorical sense, in the most direct and practical sense possible. Wireless messages had been arriving throughout April 14th from ships that had already passed through the waters ahead of Titanic or were currently operating in that region. These were professional communications between experienced mariners who had no reason to exaggerate. They named positions with coordinates. They described what they had seen. They provided the specific positional intelligence that any careful navigator would want before taking a large passenger ship through a section of ocean known to contain ice at that time of year. The information existed. It was transmitted clearly and received. The question of what happened to it between reception and the bridge is where this part of the story becomes complicated and worth examining slowly. The information that came through the wireless room that day was not a single dramatic warning arriving at a crisis moment. It was a series of ordinary professional communications spread across the hours of a normal working day. Each one received, each one processed, each one entered into the available picture of conditions ahead. Not one of them was treated as an emergency, because none of them by itself was one. Taken together, they described something more significant than any single message conveyed. But no one was tasked with standing back and reading them as a pattern. They were individual messages, and they were handled as such. The first ice warning came early. The Carpathia reported field ice and bergs at a position north of the shipping lane. This arrived in the morning. It was received and acknowledged, and the position was noted. It was the kind of warning Atlantic navigators received regularly in April and May, and it was treated with the professional attention appropriate to a routine but real hazard. The Baltic sent a warning in the early afternoon describing a large quantity of field ice and several large bergs reported by another vessel. Captain Smith received this message and walked it to the bridge where it was acknowledged. He also showed it briefly to J. Bruce Ismay, who pocketed it. The message was carried in Ismay's pocket for several hours before being returned to the captain later in the afternoon. The precise nature of what passed between Ismay and Smith in this exchange has never been fully established. Ismay later testified that the message was simply shown to him informally. Smith later showed it to other officers. The warning was available. The America sent a message reporting 2 large icebergs directly in the path of the standard shipping lane. This warning was addressed to the United States Hydrographic Office and was relayed through Titanic wireless because America was transmitting on behalf of the government authority rather than directly to Titanic. It has been questioned in hindsight whether this message was ever formally passed to the bridge. It arrived. What became of it is not fully established in the record. The Nordam sent a warning. The Californian sent a warning early in the evening describing a large field of ice and pack, ice and bergs. These warnings were noted. The Californian warning arrived at the bridge and was seen by the officers on watch. And then there was the Mesaba. But the Mesaba message belongs to the next chapter because it arrived at a specific moment and was handled in a specific way that separates it from the earlier warnings. It was not one of 7. It was something different. It was the most precisely placed and the most directly relevant warning Titanic received that day, and it arrived at exactly the worst possible time for it to be received correctly. What the earlier warnings established collectively was a picture, not a vague picture, and not a seasonal generality. A specific one with positions and descriptions and the credibility of professional mariners who had just passed through those waters. Ice, field, ice, and bergs, and in some reports, growlers. Smaller chunks of ice lower in the water and harder to see, at positions that the officers could plot on their charts and compare against their own projected track and arrival time at each point. By the afternoon of April 14th, the senior officers of Titanic knew they were sailing toward an area where multiple vessels had independently reported significant ice concentrations. They knew this not as rumor or seasonal caution, but as specific positional intelligence received in the hours immediately before they were due to enter that region. The decision-making that followed was the decision-making of experienced professionals operating within an established system. It was not careless. The course adjustment moved the ship south. The watches continued. The crow's nest was occupied. The officers on the bridge were alert and capable. What was not done was what no Atlantic captain was in the habit of doing. The ship did not slow. The logic of maintaining speed in known ice conditions was not irrational, even if it turned out to be wrong. A faster ship spent less time in a dangerous region. Speed meant the ice field was behind you sooner. The assumption underneath this logic was that a lookout in the crow's nest on a clear night would see any significant obstacle at a distance great enough to allow the ship to turn. This assumption had never been proven catastrophically wrong until now. There is also the question of the atmosphere that evening and what it contributed to the conditions the lookouts faced. The extreme cold caused an optical phenomenon called thermal inversion in the air just above the water. This effect bends light in ways that distort the horizon and can make objects near the waterline appear to hover or disappear against the surface. The iceberg was dark. It was at or near the horizon. The thermal inversion may have made it harder to detect visually, even for alert and experienced lookouts. This is contested in the scientific literature and cannot be stated as confirmed fact. But it is a genuine possibility that the physical conditions of the atmosphere that night made visual detection harder than it would have been under normal conditions. The warnings said ice ahead. They could not account for the atmosphere. It is worth pausing here on the texture of what the officers knew and what they were doing with what they knew. These were not men who had been told ice was nearby and ignored the information and carried on without thought. They had received the warnings. They had discussed the situation at watch handover. They had made a course adjustment. They had officers at their posts who were taking their duties seriously. The lookouts in the crow's nest were doing their job. Everything that the professional standards of the era required had been carried out correctly. The problem was not that the warnings were ignored. The problem was that the professional standards of the era had been built on a foundation of experience that had not yet included this specific combination of factors. Extreme cold, no moon, a perfectly flat sea with no wave action at the base of any obstacle, an iceberg that presented dark instead of bright. These conditions together produced a scenario the existing response system was not designed for. The warnings said ice was ahead. They could not say that the tools being used to detect it would fail precisely tonight. This is the gap between receiving information and truly understanding its full implication. The warnings were received and processed and responded to through a system of professional judgment that had served reliably before. That system had never been tested in precisely this combination of conditions. That night was the test. And the test revealed a gap that no one had seen because no one had yet looked for it from the far side of the disaster it would cause. The ice was out there in the dark ahead. The warnings had pointed to it. The ship moved toward it at full speed through a night that offered no resistance and no visible sign of what was waiting. Chapter 10. The Message That Never Arrived. At approximately 9:40 p.m. on the night of April 14th, 1912, the steamship Mesaba transmitted a wireless message. The Mesaba was an Atlantic transport line vessel operating in the same general region of the North Atlantic. She had been traveling through an area of significant ice that day, and her officers had seen what was ahead. The message the Mesaba sent described the situation precisely. It stated that in a specific range of coordinates running across the path that Titanic was following, there was a large amount of field ice and a great number of large icebergs. The coordinates in the Mesaba message placed this ice directly on the route Titanic was taking at the speed she was traveling, not to the north of the lane, not in a region she had already passed through. In the water directly ahead of her in the hours remaining before midnight. This was different from the earlier warnings in a specific and critical way. The earlier warnings had described ice in general positions that required the officers to compare coordinates and estimate whether the reported ice might affect their track. Some of those positions were far enough from the projected course that they did not represent immediate danger. The Mesaba message described ice at positions that overlapped with where Titanic would be within the next hour or two. If that message had reached the bridge and been plotted on the chart, the result would have been an immediate and specific warning that ice lay directly in the path of the ship at the speed she was traveling. The message was received by Jack Phillips in the wireless room. Phillips was at that moment in the middle of working through the backlog of passenger messages that had accumulated during the earlier equipment failure. The commercial traffic bound for Cape Race was substantial. He was busy. The Mesaba message arrived and was acknowledged by Phillips with a standard acknowledgement. And then it sat. It was not taken to the bridge. It was placed in the wireless room and not passed up the chain of communication because Phillips was occupied with passenger traffic and did not interrupt his commercial work to carry it forward. There are several factors that contributed to this failure of information. The Mesaba message did not carry an urgent prefix. Under the wireless conventions of the time, certain messages were prefixed with a designation that required their immediate physical delivery to the captain or the officer of the watch, regardless of whatever else was happening in the power. Wireless room. The prefix was the system by which urgency was communicated and acted on. This message was not prefixed in that way. Without the urgent prefix, it was treated as regular navigational traffic to be processed in order. Phillips was not a navigation officer and had not been trained to evaluate the strategic significance of the positional information in the messages he handled. He processed traffic. The people who were trained to evaluate navigational significance were on the bridge, and on that particular night, the connection between the wireless room and the bridge failed at this specific message. The information that should have moved did not move. It is possible to imagine the small and entirely ordinary reasons this happened without anyone acting badly. Phillips was tired. He had been working for many hours, repairing equipment and then clearing the backlog. He had commercial obligations that were well understood within the structure of his employment. The Mesaba message arrived during a busy period, and it did not announce itself as different from the other traffic he was handling. No one came from the bridge to ask if any new warnings had been received. The system for ensuring that navigational warnings reached the bridge relied on the initiative of the wireless operator rather than on a formal mandatory delivery protocol. That was a design flaw in the system, not in the individual. The officer of the watch at the time the Mesaba message arrived would have been acting on the information in his possession. His possession did not include the Mesaba message. He had the earlier warnings from the Carpathia and Baltic and Californian. He had the adjusted course. He had the lookouts in the crow's nest. He had all of this, and he did not have the one message that placed large quantities of ice precisely on the route ahead. His professional judgment was applied to an incomplete picture, and nothing about the incomplete picture signaled to him that it was incomplete. This is the architecture of the gap, not recklessness, not indifference. A system that was adequate for many things and inadequate for precisely this one thing at precisely this one moment. The information existed, and the people were present, and the capability to respond was real. The gap was in the structure that connected them. This is not a story of deliberate negligence. It is a story of a system in which responsibility was distributed in ways that created a gap exactly here. The wireless operator processed traffic. The officer of the watch acted on what he received. Between those two functions, a specific and critical piece of information failed to move. The message existed. The information it contained was accurate. The ice it described was there exactly where the Mesaba said it would be, and none of the officers on the bridge that night knew the Mesaba had sent it. Captain Smith retired at approximately 9 in the evening. He retired believing the ice situation was understood and that normal professional precautions were in place. He did not know about the Mesaba message. The officers on watch did not know about the Mesaba message. First Officer Murdoch, taking over at 10 p.m., did not know about the Mesaba message. The ship continued at full speed into the region the message described. Imagine for a moment what might have happened if the message had been delivered. If Phillips had carried the slip of paper up to the bridge before returning to his commercial traffic. Or if the officer on watch had been told directly that a new warning had come in. The chart would have been consulted. The position would have been plotted. The coordinates in the Mesaba message placed the ice at a distance the ship could reach within 1 to 2 hours at current speed. The officer on watch would have had a specific and immediate decision to make. Reduce speed. Change course. Wake the captain. Something. We cannot know what would have been decided, but a decision would have been made with accurate and timely information. Instead, the decision that was made was the default one, continue, because nothing had changed that required a different response. The message that never arrived is not the entire cause of the disaster. The ship was in an ice field regardless of any single warning, and other factors contributed to the outcome. But the Mesaba message represents the clearest single point in the chain of that night, where better information handling would have given the officers a real and specific opportunity to respond differently. It arrived in time to matter. It described the danger accurately and with precise coordinates. It contained exactly the kind of specific positional intelligence that, when received and acted on by experienced navigators, would have prompted an immediate response. It simply stopped moving before it reached the people whose job it was to act on it. Consider what that means in terms of the night as it unfolded. The officers on the bridge were not negligent. They were working with the information they had. The information they had was incomplete in one critical way, and they had no means of knowing it was incomplete. They could not feel the gap. They could not see the absence of the Mesaba warning. They could only respond to what was in front of them. And what was in front of them that night at 10 p.m., at 11 p.m., through the deepening cold of the clear North Atlantic night, was a steady ship on a known course in conditions that felt entirely manageable. At 9:40 p.m., the Mesaba finished transmitting and returned to its normal duties. At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet rang the bell in the crow's nest. In the 2 hours between those two moments, the message sat in the wireless room unread by anyone on the bridge of the ship it had been trying to warn. Chapter 11. Thomas Andrews counts the rooms. Thomas Andrews moved through the flooding ship with a calm that those who witnessed it later described as remarkable, and in some accounts deeply unsettling to observe. It was not the forced calm of someone concealing fear. It was the focus of a person who had set aside everything irrelevant and was concentrating entirely on the task that needed doing. The task was understanding exactly what had happened to the ship he had built and what it meant for the people aboard. He moved through the spaces of the vessel as someone who had always known them. This was not unfamiliar territory. He had walked these corridors and companionways and compartments many times. The difference now was that some of those spaces had cold water in them, and the water was rising. He was the designer. He knew this vessel from its conception. He had been present at every significant stage of its construction. He had walked these corridors and stairwells and compartments many times before departure on this voyage. He knew what the drawings looked like, and he knew what the physical reality had become, and he knew the relationship between the two with a precision that no one else aboard possessed. When Captain Smith summoned him shortly after midnight and took him below to assess the damage, he was the only person on the ship who could perform the calculation that needed performing. He did it with a thoroughness that could not be softened into something more hopeful. In the minutes after the collision, the situation was not yet understood by the officers on the bridge. The ship had struck something and had stopped, and early reports were arriving from the lower decks. Water was entering in certain forward areas. The extent was not clear. The nature of the damage was not clear. What was clear was that Thomas Andrews needed to go below and see for himself, and that his assessment of what he found would be the basis for everything that followed. Captain Smith knew this. Andrews knew it. The two men went below together. Andrews moved through the forward lower decks with the calm of a person who is doing a job that needs doing, regardless of what the job reveals. He was not performing calm. He had simply put aside everything that was not relevant to the assessment and focused entirely on measurement, the compartments that mattered, the water levels in each, the rate at which those levels were rising, the structural relationship between each flooded space and the ones adjacent to it. He moved through water in some of the lower spaces. He saw the evidence directly rather than inferring it from reports. And what he saw confirmed the worst of what the physical reports had suggested. 5 watertight compartments had been compromised. Water was entering all 5 simultaneously. The rate of entry was significant and measurable. Andrews knew the design with complete precision. He knew the maximum flooding the ship could sustain and remain afloat. He knew the bulkhead heights, which had not been extended to the full height of the deck above them, as a cost and weight decision made during design. He knew the waterline calculations and the critical point at which flooding in the forward section would pull the bow down far enough that water would begin spilling over the top of the bulkheads from one flooded space to the next. He had the complete structural picture in his mind as he walked through the compartments and measured what was actually happening against what he knew in theory. The theory and the reality matched exactly. The damage had been done in the worst possible configuration, not at the bow where a head-on collision would have flooded fewer compartments. Along the side where the iceberg had opened just enough spaces in just the right arrangement to exceed the limit the design could survive. He went back to Captain Smith. The calculation was not approximate. Andrews knew the flooding rate and he knew the design parameters, and he worked out the result with the precision of a man who had spent years understanding exactly this kind of structural mathematics. Titanic could survive the flooding of 4 forward compartments. 5 were flooding. The 5th was the compartment that broke the mathematics of survival. The water would rise, the bow would pull down. The sea would come over the tops of the bulkheads from one flooded space to the next in an unstoppable progression. The ship would sink. Andrews told Captain Smith the ship had 1 hour, perhaps slightly more. Not more than 2 hours. She was going down. This was approximately 12:15 a.m. The ship had struck the iceberg at approximately 11:40 p.m. 35 minutes had passed since the collision. Most passengers were still in their cabins or had been mildly roused by the faint impact and then settled back to sleep when everything appeared to return to normal. The ship was still completely upright. The lights throughout the vessel burned normally. The engines were stopped, but there was no visible sign of serious distress. In the corridors and public rooms of the upper decks, everything looked precisely as it had looked at dinner time several hours earlier. The wood paneling was the same, the carpet was the same. The electric lights cast the same warm light they always did. A person walking those corridors and not knowing what Andrews now knew would have had no reason to feel alarmed. Andrews knew. He spent the remaining time doing what he could within the limits of what was now possible. He moved through the ship systematically. He spoke to crew members and to passengers he encountered in corridors. He advised people to put on their lifebelts and to go up to the boat deck. He spoke directly and plainly to those who asked him what was happening. He went to the first-class cabins of people he knew by name from the voyage and knocked on their doors and urged them to dress warmly and go up. Not because he had been assigned this task by any officer, because he was a man who knew what was coming and found it impossible to walk past people who were still asleep or confused or standing in corridors in evening dress, asking calm questions about whether the ship was in any real difficulty. The dissonance of those minutes was profound. The ship was still lit, the engines were stopped, but the structure was intact and the lights burned normally. First-class passengers who had been woken and told to put on lifebelts stood in corridors that looked exactly as they had at dinner time and tried to make sense of why they were being asked to leave a warm ship for a cold and open boat. Andrews told them plainly when asked. The ship was going to sink. he did not soften it. There was no softer version to offer. He was seen in the first-class lounge, late in the sinking, standing alone. His lifebelt was on the settee beside him. He had not put it on. Whether this was a decision or simply the state of a man absorbed entirely in something other than his own survival, the historical record cannot say. He was last seen alive in the first-class smoking room. He was 39 years old. The calculation Thomas Andrews performed in those lower compartments after midnight was the most consequential piece of arithmetic in the history of North Atlantic travel. It was correct in every specific. The bow sank at the rate his estimate implied. The water came over the bulkheads in the progression his knowledge of the design predicted. The ship broke apart and went under at approximately the time his estimate allowed. He had designed the vessel, and he had calculated how long it had to live, and he had spent the intervening hours doing what a person who knows something terrible and cannot stop it can do. He walked through the ship, and he told people the truth. Chapter 12. 60 feet to the water. The lifeboats on Titanic were hung in davits along the boat deck on both sides of the ship. There were 20 of them. 14 standard wooden lifeboats, 2 emergency cutters, and 4 collapsible boats with canvas sides that could be raised into position. Their combined capacity was approximately 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people aboard. The mathematics of this situation had existed since before the ship left Southampton. It was not hidden. The Board of Trade Regulations required the ship to carry lifeboat capacity for a certain number of persons based on tonnage rather than on the actual number of people aboard. Titanic met those regulations comfortably. The regulations themselves were simply inadequate. They had not been updated since a time when ships were smaller and the calculation had been different. No one responsible for setting those regulations had been required to imagine what happened if you actually needed the boats. The order to begin loading the lifeboats was given by Captain Smith at approximately 12:20 a.m. This was approximately 40 minutes after the collision and approximately 5 minutes after Thomas Andrews had given the captain his assessment. The order reached the officers on the boat deck, who began the process of preparing the davits and opening the boats and attempting to bring passengers up to the deck. The process immediately encountered the problem that would define the entire evacuation. The ship did not look like it was sinking. Stand on the boat deck of Titanic at 12:30 a.m. on April 15th and try to understand what you were being asked to do. The ship was upright. She was fully lit. The deck was stable beneath your feet, although if you were paying close attention, you might have felt that it was not quite as level as it had been an hour before. The night was cold but clear. The air was perfectly still. You had been asleep or in the smoking room or in your cabin reading when you were woken or found. You had been on this ship for 4 days, and everything had been steady and reliable and exactly as advertised. And now an officer was asking you to leave this large, warm-lit, permanent-feeling thing and step into a small, open wooden boat and be lowered 60 feet down the dark side of the hull on ropes to a black sea that was barely visible far below. The boat looked very small. The water looked very far. The ship looked very solid. Nothing about the sensory experience of standing on that deck supported the idea that the ship was going to sink. Everything supported the idea that it was fine, that the boat was the risk and the ship was the safety. This was the central psychological problem of the evacuation, and it played out differently at different moments and in different parts of the ship. Early in the loading, the passengers who were brought up were in many cases doing what any reasonable person would do when told to leave a stable, warm ship on a cold night for an open boat. They hesitated. They went back inside. They were persuaded and then walked away again. They stood at the rail and looked down and looked back at the ship and made the calculation that most human beings in that moment made. They stayed. As the night progressed and the angle of the ship became visible and undeniable, the calculus shifted. People who had declined to board earlier returned to the boat deck to find the boats already launched. The later stages of the evacuation were characterized by urgency and crowding, and boats that could not be properly prepared, and a ship that was visibly and rapidly descending. The difference between the first hour of the evacuation and the last hour was the difference between persuasion failing and desperation arriving. By the time the urgency was undeniable, many of the boats were already gone. This produced a specific and terrible outcome. The first boats were launched substantially underloaded. Lifeboat number 1 left with 12 people aboard. Its capacity was 40. Lifeboat number 6 left with approximately 28 people aboard. Its capacity was 65. Across the early launches on both sides of the ship, the pattern was similar. Boats leaving with space available because the people who were supposed to fill that space looked at the dark water 60 feet below and chose the lit ship instead. The officers managing the loading were not all making the same decisions. Second Officer Lightoller commanded the port side davits. First Officer Murdoch commanded the starboard side. Lightoller interpreted the order women and children first with absolute strictness. While women and children remained in the vicinity, no man entered a boat under his watch. Several boats on the port side left with seats unfilled rather than allow men to board when no women were immediately present. Murdoch on the starboard side allowed men to board when no women or children were nearby waiting. Neither officer was acting improperly. They were exercising professional judgment in the space where explicit instruction did not exist. The difference in their interpretations cost lives. Third-class passengers faced a different challenge entirely. Their quarters were in the lowest decks of the ship. The route to the boat deck was long, and for many passengers unfamiliar. They had not been given tours of the ship on departure. They did not know the fastest routes upward. Some routes were gated. Immigration regulations that governed the separation of classes during normal voyage operations remained in effect at the start of the emergency before crew had received updated guidance. Language barriers complicated any instruction shouted or gestured by crew members who did not share a language with the people they were trying to direct. When third-class passengers began arriving at the boat deck in larger numbers, it was often to find that the standard lifeboats were already gone. The evacuation of Titanic lasted approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes from the first boat launched to the last boat that left with people aboard. In that time, 20 boats departed the ship, most of them with fewer people than they could safely carry. The collapsible boats were difficult to prepare in the deteriorating conditions as the ship listed and the angle of the forward deck increased. They needed to be set up manually on the roof of the officers' quarters and lowered. The increasing angle of the ship made this work dangerous and in some cases impossible to complete in the normal way. The last of the collapsibles was swept off the deck by the rising water rather than being properly launched. People swam to it in the dark, and some found it floating upside down and clung to its hull and survived the night that way. Others swam toward it and did not find it. Isidor Strauss refused to take a seat in a lifeboat while any other man was still aboard. His wife, Ida, refused to leave without him. She was offered a seat multiple times by crew and by her husband, and by other passengers who recognized them both. She declined each time. The two of them were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the ship went down. They had been married for decades. What they said to each other in those final hours is not known, and cannot be known, and should not be invented. The architecture of the boat deck that had separated classes in comfort now separated them in survival. The distance from a first-class suite to a lifeboat was short and familiar. The distance from a third-class berth to a lifeboat was long and unknown and full of locked doors and language barriers, and a ship that was pulling downward under your feet as you climbed toward a deck you had never been on. 62% of first-class passengers survived. 25% of third-class passengers survived. The boats left. And below them, the ship continued its slow and inevitable descent. Chapter 13. Signals in the Dark. While the lifeboats were being loaded on the deck above, Jack Phillips was transmitting into the dark from the small, warm, wireless room near the top of the forward superstructure. He had been at the quay since shortly after midnight when Captain Smith came to the wireless room and gave the order to send the distress call. Phillips had begun immediately, without hesitation. The signal went out. CQD, the traditional maritime distress call that every operator on the North Atlantic would recognize. And at the suggestion of Harold Bride standing beside him, he also began alternating in the newer international signal that had been formally adopted only 3 years earlier. SOS. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. It was the first time a ship in genuine life-threatening distress had transmitted SOS on the North Atlantic. The signals went out in alternating form containing Titanic position and the nature of the emergency and the request for immediate assistance. They traveled outward across the dark surrounding ocean in all directions at the speed of light. Electromagnetic signals that could cover 50 miles in the fraction of a second that it took the water in the forward compartments to rise by another fraction of an inch. The ocean was large, the cold was absolute. But the signals went out, and the signals were heard. The responses came in one by one across the open frequency. The Carpathia heard it, the Frankfurt heard it, the Mount Temple heard it, the Baltic heard it from some distance east. The Olympic heard it from much farther east still. The Carpathia response was the one that would matter in practical terms for the people in the water. She was approximately 58 miles away to the southeast. Captain Arthur Rostron received the distress call personally at approximately 12:25 a.m., and his response in the minutes and hours that followed was later described in both the American Senate inquiry and the British Board of Trade inquiry as a model of what a professional emergency response looked like. He turned his ship immediately without waiting for confirmation or further information. He increased speed beyond its normal operating parameters, driving the engines harder than standard practice allowed and accepting the mechanical risk that came with that decision. He posted additional ice lookouts at the bow and on both wings of the bridge because pushing his own ship at high speed through an ice field in darkness was itself a real and serious risk, and he was taking it deliberately. He ordered his medical staff to prepare. He organized the crew into teams to receive survivors and identified which areas of the ship would serve as triage and care spaces. He did all of this before he knew how many people he was heading toward, before he knew what he would find. He took the position from the distress signal and he drove his ship toward it as fast as it would go and accepted every consequence of that decision. At 58 miles, and the speed Carpathia could achieve, the crossing would take approximately 4 hours. This was a brutal calculation. 4 hours was longer than anyone in 28-degree water would survive. It was longer than the Titanic had remaining above the surface. Carpathia was coming. She was coming faster than she had ever gone, and she was not going to arrive in time to save the people in the water. She would save those who were already in boats. The people in the sea were beyond saving by the time she arrived. The cold water had done its work before dawn came. Now to the ship that was already there. The steamship Californian had stopped earlier that evening at approximately 10:30 p.m. Her captain, Stanley Lord, had decided that the conditions were too dangerous to proceed through the ice field in darkness and had ordered the engines stopped and the ship to wait for daylight. She was sitting in the ice field with her engines off. She was the closest vessel to Titanic that night, and her wireless operator Cyril Evans had gone to bed at 11:10 p.m. He had gone off duty 30 minutes before Titanic struck the iceberg. He had been cut off mid-message by Phillips earlier in the evening, who was handling Cape Race traffic and had sent Evans a curt instruction to stand by. Evans had been tired and his shift had ended, and there was no requirement keeping him at the equipment. He turned it off and went to sleep. There was no one monitoring the Californian wireless when the distress calls began going out across the dark surrounding sea. The most powerful signal on the North Atlantic that night was transmitting into a room where no one was listening. On the bridge of the Californian, the officers on watch saw lights in the distance. They could see a vessel some miles away. They watched as rockets were fired from the direction of that vessel. White rockets, fired at intervals. Rockets at sea carried specific meaning in the maritime practice of the era. They were signals of distress. The crew of the Californian saw these rockets. They discussed them. They considered explanations that did not require them to be distress signals. They reported them to Captain Lord, who was informed twice that rockets were being seen in the distance. Lord asked questions. He received uncertain answers about the nature of the vessel and the rockets. He did not order the ship to proceed toward the rockets. He did not order Evans to be woken and the wireless started. He went back to his rest. The subsequent inquiries into the disaster examined this sequence with considerable intensity. The American inquiry concluded directly that the Californian could have saved many lives and did not. The British inquiry was more measured but reached similar conclusions. The question of how far the Californian was from Titanic that night has never been precisely resolved. Estimates from various sources place her between 10 and 20 miles from the sinking ship. Whether she could have arrived in time to take people from the water before hypothermia made rescue impossible depends on the estimate used. What is not in dispute is that she was close enough to see rockets. She saw rockets, and she stayed where she was. The historical debate about Captain Lord and his officers has continued for more than a century without reaching a fully settled conclusion. Those who have argued in Lord's defense contend that the vessel they saw may not have been Titanic at all, that the rockets could have been company signals rather than distress signals, that the ice conditions and uncertainty about the other vessel distance would have made any response dangerous. Those who have argued against him point to the rockets themselves and to the maritime meaning they carried without ambiguity. Rockets fired from a vessel at night were distress signals. That was their established purpose. Seeing them and staying in place was an extraordinary choice regardless of uncertainty about which ship was out there. The professional standard did not require certainty about the identity of the vessel. It required investigation. What is confirmed and not disputed in either the historical record or by any serious examination of the event is the outcome. The Californian remained where she was through the entire night. Her engines stayed off. Her wireless stayed silent. The rockets fired from Titanic were seen and discussed, and the captain was informed, and nothing was done. By the time Evans was woken at dawn and the wireless resumed, it was already over. Carpathia had collected the survivors. The Californian arrived to find open ocean and debris. Phillips transmitted until the electrical systems could no longer be maintained. He had been at the quay for more than 2 hours. He was still there when Bride last saw him. Bride survived. Phillips did not. He had done exactly what he had trained to do in exactly this situation. The signals had gone out and had been received across hundreds of miles of dark ocean. But of all the vessels close enough to matter that night, only one came, and one was not enough. Chapter 14. What Remained. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, the RMS Titanic was no longer on the surface of the North Atlantic. The final minutes had been witnessed by hundreds of people in the lifeboats who sat in the dark a safe distance from the ship and watched. The bow had been pulling down for more than an hour. By the final stage, the angle of the deck was severe. The stern had risen high above the waterline. The lights of the ship continued burning through almost the entire descent. This was because the engineers below remained at their posts, maintaining electrical power as long as the conditions allowed them to do so. The lights flickered and then went out when the sea reached the machinery spaces. In the dark, the stern continued rising, and then at the critical structural point, the ship broke apart. The forward section separated from the aft under the enormous stress of the angle. The bow went under. The stern fell back briefly and then sank too. The sound that accompanied this had been described by survivors in different ways. A roar, a grinding, an explosion of air and steam. Multiple loud reports as internal structures gave way under the pressure of the angles and the flooding. And then it was over. The ship was gone. What remained was the ocean and the dark and the cold, and the sound of approximately 1,500 people in the water. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. A person in water that cold begins losing motor function within minutes. Consciousness follows shortly after. Death from cardiac arrest caused by cold water shock can occur in the first minutes of immersion. For those who survived the initial shock, death from hypothermia in water of this temperature follows within 15 to 45 minutes, depending on body type and clothing and individual physiology. The people in the water had no life jackets that could keep their faces clear of the surface. They had no shelter from the cold. They had no source of warmth approaching them quickly enough to reach them in time. The lifeboats were in the water. There were 20 of them with space for additional passengers. The people in the boats could hear the people in the water. The question of why more boats did not return immediately to the site to take on survivors has also been examined in the inquiries and in the historical literature with considerable care. The answer is a combination of factors. The fear that swimmers would swamp the boats by climbing aboard in numbers the small vessels could not carry. The darkness and the difficulty of navigating back through the debris. The noise, the cold, the shock of what had just been witnessed. Most boats did not return. Lifeboat 14, under the direction of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, was one of the few that went back after consolidating passengers with other boats to free up space. By the time Lowe returned to the site, the voices had nearly stopped. He recovered a small number of people from the water who were still alive. The rest were gone. Carpathia arrived at approximately 4:10 a.m. She moved through the debris field in the early grey light of dawn. The lifeboats emerged from the dark around her. One by one, they came alongside. 710 survivors were taken aboard over the course of several hours. Carpathia then turned toward New York. She arrived on the evening of April 18th to find the docks crowded with thousands of people who had come to meet the survivors and the news photographers and the reporters and the families who had been waiting since the first. Fragmentary wireless reports began arriving days earlier. The world changed quickly after the disaster. The speed of the regulatory response was remarkable by any historical comparison. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was drafted within 2 years. It became known as SOLAS, and it established requirements that still govern maritime safety today. Lifeboat capacity for all persons aboard. 24-hour wireless watchkeeping on all passenger vessels. Established ice patrol routes in the North Atlantic. The International Ice Patrol was created by agreement of 16 nations within a year of the disaster. It began operations in 1913 and has been operating continuously ever since. No ocean liner has sunk due to iceberg collision since the SOLAS regulations came into effect. The wreck of Titanic was not found for 73 years. It was located on September 1, 1985, by a joint American and French expedition led by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel using an unmanned deep-sea camera vehicle called Argo. The wreck lay at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, nearly 2.5 miles below the surface. In absolute darkness, in water temperatures near freezing. The bow section was found first. It had buried itself into the sea floor on impact. The stern section was found separately, approximately 2,000 feet away. It had imploded as it descended through the water column and was in a state of far greater disintegration than the bow. The field of debris between the two sections contained the objects of the interior: dishes, shoes, bottles, personal items. The accumulated domestic evidence of a hotel that had functioned for 4 days and then been distributed across a section of seafloor nearly a mile square. In 2022 and 2023, a company called Magellan Limited working with Atlantic Productions, completed the first full-scale, three-dimensional digital scan of the entire wreck site. The scanning vessel made more than 200 dives using deep-sea submersibles. The result was the most complete visual record of the Titanic that had ever been made, a full-size digital twin of the wreck. Every surface that remained above the silt, every object in the debris field that could be resolved by the imaging system. The detail was sufficient to read serial numbers on recovered equipment, to identify individual deck chairs, to trace the outline of where walls had once stood in spaces now open to the ocean. The scan also documented what was being lost. The wreck of Titanic is being eaten. A colony of iron-eating bacteria discovered on the hull in 1991, called Halomonas titanicae, has been consuming the steel at a measurable rate. The forward railing of the bow section, that was one of the most iconic images of the wreck when it was first found and filmed, has now collapsed and fallen. The officers' quarters have deteriorated significantly. The crow's nest where Frederick Fleet stood on the night of April 14th is gone. The wreck will continue to disappear. The rate of deterioration means that within several decades, the remaining structure will have substantially collapsed into the silt. The Titanic that future generations will be able to examine will be the digital scan. The real thing will be gone. What remains when a ship as large as Titanic sinks is first chaos, and then silence, and then over a century, a particular kind of preservation and loss running simultaneously. The objects in the debris field have been surprisingly well preserved by the cold and the dark and the pressure, personal effects, clothing, papers in some cases, the physical traces of lives that ended at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. The ship itself is returning to the ocean that claimed it, one molecule of iron at a time. The 15,000-year-old ice that started this story dissolved in 14 days. The ship that met it is taking longer, but it is going the same way. What remains at the end of this story is not the ship and not the ice. It is the specific and unrepeatable fact of 2,224 human lives converging on the same place and time. 710 who survived, more than 1,500 who did not, and the world that changed in the long aftermath of learning what it had done wrong and choosing to do better. That is what remains. The lesson and the silence of a cold, dark ocean floor, where a great ship is slowly and quietly becoming part of the sea.